I recently did a video on the anime hits from 2017 called Your Name, and today's video will focus on another hit from the same year, A Silent Voice, also known as The Shape of Voice or Koe No Katachi. It's an extremely deep film looking at challenging subjects such as mental health and had a hugely profound impact on me personally, having discussed topics that hit close to home and are important to me. The motivation for this video was that I recently came to realise that for all that I thought about being accepting of myself, I wasn't actually very self-accepting. Having confided in a friend of mine, she made me come to realise how hard I am on myself, but also made me think that had I treated others the same way, it would have been considered abusive. Ironically, YouTube then suggested music from A Silent Voice, and I realised similarities I shared with the lead character in the film, motivating me to create this video. So before we look at A Silent Voice, it's worth having a quick recap of the story, and just to confirm, there are spoilers discussed ahead. The story centres around Shoya and Shoko, the first being a young man who as a child bullied Shoko for being deaf and in turn suffered years of bullying himself, suffering social anxiety and depression. At 18, he chooses to try and build a relationship with Shoko, and along the way builds a close unit of friends with her. Fundamentally, events unfold in a drama where various mental health issues come to the fore for various characters, but the story centres on Shoya, who after years of being tormented by anxiety and depression, finally comes to accept himself and move forward in life. There is a lot to cover in A Silent Voice, being a deep film with great metaphors using the legend of the koi fish, the use of a notepad, and its importance in communication, as well as various mental health issues covered through the story. However, rather than doing a complete analysis of the whole film, I wanted to focus on probably the most prevalent theme of self-acceptance, something that I can't understate the importance of and think needs to be covered in depth. I will be focusing on Shoya's journey through the story, as while other characters, notably Shoko, have equally important character arcs to cover, Shoya's is the most in-depth and centred on the subject of self-acceptance. Also, if you do have any mental health issues, please seek help and support. It's a serious issue for many and isn't something people need to try and contend with alone. Self-acceptance versus self-love. So as we begin, it's worth understanding the distinction between self-acceptance and self-love, as while acute it's beneficial to know the subtleties to ensure that you don't mistake one for the other, but importantly, also identify how they benefit you in practice. Self-acceptance is to acknowledge yourself fully, to understand what you're capable of, but equally appreciate that you have limitations and moments where you won't achieve what you might set out to from the outset. Self-love is to care for yourself, and more specifically, to treat yourself as you would a loved one. We often have the tendency to tyrannize ourselves when we aren't accepting of our failures, something we wouldn't do to someone we care about if we know their intention was otherwise. Instead, to love is to forgive and take steps to try and avoid reoccurrences. The reason to understand the distinction is to understand how your behaviour towards yourself affects you. Without acceptance, we can't move on to loving ourselves, meaning the latter is predicated on the former. While acceptance is to ratify your success or failure in a given endeavour, love is distinctly about how you treat yourself. In A Silent Voice, Shoya's journey to the end of the film is almost completely focused on the idea of self-acceptance, as he cannot forgive past actions through the course of the film until its very conclusion, despite feeling great remorse. At which point he comes to accept his place in the world, acknowledging his strengths and flaws. The conclusion suggests that as part of his acceptance, he will follow through with self-love, allowing himself to enjoy his various relationships and to finally stop persecuting himself over past mistakes. Why you need self-acceptance and self-love. The effects of not showing yourself acceptance and love can be incredibly hard on you and your mental health, Many tend to fall into a state of depression in the way that they treat themselves, and this often leads to damaging consequences in their lives. However, not just depression, anxiety is also closely linked to the lack of self-acceptance or love. For example, those suffering social anxiety might find themselves scrutinizing their every action when trying to deal with any kind of relationship, usually stemming from the fact that they just don't seem to be able to accept themselves and their actions in such situations. We see this with Shoya in A Silent Voice, as he suffers high levels of social anxiety as a young adult, following years of being bullied. While others come to accept him, even members of Shoko's family, he himself can never forgive himself, always feeling the guilt of his past actions. It leads to depression, as is seen in scenes early on in the film where Shoya is about to commit suicide, something he continues to try and contend with throughout the film and doesn't truly overcome until the end, when he finally accepts himself, finally letting go of the anxiety that gripped him and coming to the realization not only is he not hated as he thought, but he can accept the love others have for him, allowing him to move forward in life in a healthy way. How to be more self-accepting. One of the biggest challenges many, including myself, face is to identify how to be more self-accepting and avoid falling into pitfalls of becoming self-abusive. In my personal experience, I find the most effective way is to follow a sequence of steps that help me focus on objectively reviewing a situation, rather than allowing emotional response to drive it. The steps are as follows. Number 1. Identify your trigger points. The problem we often face is that when faced with a failure of some kind, we're quick to get frustrated or angry with ourselves. In my case, this is often in the form of muttering expletives at myself. In Shoya's, it's usually a more submissive response, to accept blame without acknowledging whether or not he was wrong. If you can, try to stop yourself before you start responding emotionally, or at least as quickly as possible. We know instantly whether something is a success or not. The problems usually arise when we don't control the emotional response. Number 2. Be mindful. Once you've done the first step and caught yourself from going into an emotional flurry in response to an issue, you need to actively take steps to mindfully view the circumstance. This is effectively to detach yourself from the problem and instead see it for the reality that it is. For example, when we see Shoya's circumstance in A Silent Voice, he's often taking responsibility for problems that aren't of his making, and it's something Shoko also struggles with throughout the film, something that comes to an almost dire outcome near the end. By being mindful of the problem, whilst removing the emotional response from it, you can move on to more objective and productive resolutions. Number 3. Negotiate your response. At this step, you need to take steps to treating yourself with care. Let's say a family member or a friend you deeply care for were to make a mistake. You would almost certainly forgive them and decide what the correct course of action is from here on. For example, after Shoya saves Shoko from committing suicide, they share an incredibly important scene where they truly come to understand one another, as Shoya asks Shoko to stop blaming herself for the problems in their lives. It's an incredibly loving sentiment from someone who cares deeply for the other. From here, he asks her to help him continue to live. While we're often willing to show forgiveness, acceptance, and love to others, we somehow fail to do it for ourselves. We need to take time to accept ourselves and not assume blame if we're not at fault, or at least focus on the responsibility to see change when remorseful. Here, you can't tyrannize yourself, because most people in such circumstances need the support and love to guide them to a better place. Number 4. Plan a course of action. The last step is to plan a corrective course of action. In some cases, this might be to do nothing at all, but for many circumstances, this means to right your wrongs. In A Silent Voice, this comes at the end, when Shoko and Shoya attend a school festival after having numerous issues with their group of friends following preceding events. This point is a revelatory moment for Shoya, who comes to realize that despite all that's happened, his friends still accept him, still appreciate him, and most importantly, still love him. However, the key here was that he took the necessary actions to reach this point. He took the responsibility to attend the festival rather than run away, and he allowed himself to open up and be vulnerable to those around him. It was incredibly hard, but it was through his actions and self-acceptance that he came to realize that in reality, no one treated him as harshly as he treated himself. And this is the key in all of this. We often treat ourselves in an abusive way, unwilling to accept ourselves, to see the reality around us. Through identifying the triggers for an issue, you can stop yourself entering a self-destructive cycle of self-hate. By being mindful of circumstance, you can identify the reality of a situation to be able to assess it in a productive way. Through negotiating with yourself on what an appropriate response is, you no longer put yourself in a state of tyranny, but rather in a collaborative effort. Finally, by planning the corrective course of action, you decide on dealing with the situation in a way that's productive and positive, one where you're compassionate to yourself while still being effective. My journey so far. The truth is, I don't consider myself the most self-accepting or self-loving person. However, I'm making progressive steps to care for myself in a way that I would care for someone that I love, and I see this being a lifelong journey for me. I don't treat those I love as an abusive monster, yet I have done so to myself for much of my life. So I seek to provide support and guidance to reach a place where I can feel acceptance and love for myself. In this respect, the journey Shoya goes through in A Silent Voice feels very much personal to me. One where he struggles to accept himself and all he has to offer, but eventually leads him to a place where he can accept himself for who he is, and accept the love given to him from others, but most importantly, from himself. Have you seen A Silent Voice? Let me know in the comment section below. Please like, share and subscribe as we help you live life on your terms. Don't forget to hit the bell icon to ensure YouTube notifies you of the latest uploads. Thanks for watching.